Okay, what's going on, everybody? My name is Mang, and today we're going to be learning how to play Dominions 6 Rise of the Pantocrator. There are multiple videos out there designed to teach someone how to get into Dominion 6, but I wasn't really pleased with any of them, so I decided to do my own. I started playing this game. I discovered the Dominion series about a month ago. So far, I put in around 400 hours in a month. So, yes, I really like it. It's probably my favorite game, and I didn't even really like strategy games that much before this. So, it is an incredible, incredible game. And I'll assume that if you're watching this, it's probably because you have some amount of interest in learning Dominions, or you've been sent this video or suggested to find it, to something like this, from someone that is really into it and wants you to learn. That's all good. There is a lot to go over, and my goal with this is to be somewhat concise while still being relatively informative, in the hopes that by the end you'll have an understanding of a lot of the basic sort of unit stats and a lot of the basic mechanics of the game, so that you can just have a confident enough start for your own game, against maybe, you know, other newbie players in multiplayer, or against like easy AI in single player. But there is a lot to go over. I'm not going to get to everything. There's going to be mechanics you may have to delve into further yourself, or just kind of discover along the way, but I'll try to hit all the basic stuff. And I'm not an expert. Like I said, I only started playing a month ago. So there's probably going to be things that I maybe get wrong a little bit or forget about. I'm sure there might be some comments to correct me anywhere. And in general, I'm going to be speaking generally about a lot of things. You know, Dominions has like 1,000 spells and 100 different nations. So there's always going to be little exceptions to anything that I might say. But I'm just going to be speaking generally about, you know, mechanics and things like that. Right. So when you get started, assuming that you're just going to be playing single player, you're going to go to Create World, and you're going to first select the map that you're going to be playing on. The size of the map, it defaults to medium, 15 provinces per player, sort of on average. That's kind of, so it'll generate 15 usable provinces per player. That's a somewhat reasonable amount, where there's not going to be that much space for players to build up massive armies before they make contact with other nations. If you want to go for a bit longer of a game where there's more room to expand and thus more time to grow and build up armies, and your nation and everything do more magical research and all that, you know, you can make bigger and bigger maps. Or if you really want more like a knife fight in a phone booth sort of experience, you can go even smaller. I think medium is a decent starting point. And there are also custom maps on the Steam Workshop that you can grab that offer, you know, sort of preset custom designs, specific placements of terrain and things like that. And also will often utilize different sort of art styles for the tiles, or different maps in different styles, if you don't care for just the default look of the map generation here. Then you get to the layout of the world map, or the main, you know, the main map. The default is just a completely random map. I mean, obviously it follows some sort of rules for how it's generated and things like that. It's always going to be playable, but there's no specific preset design to it. Other ones do have a more specific design, such as the circle world or the donut with the lake in the middle and surrounded by water, small lakes, you know, various designs. I would say as a new player, you're probably going to be pretty fine with like just a completely random, or the circle world I've actually had a lot of good luck with, because you're most likely going to have only two neighbors. You know, there might be a water nation in the game, but we'll get to that. But if most of the time you're just going to have a neighbor kind of on your left and a neighbor on your right, and rather than avoiding some situation with a standard map where you might have like 3 or 4 neighbors kind of all surrounding you. So I think the circle world is pretty reasonable, so we'll just go with that. And then there's the underground layout. There is an underground layer that can be accessed by anyone, and certain nations will actually start underground. So the default one for this is also just a random generation, 1 or more caves of random size. You can change this to be small caves. So there's just 4 or more small caves, 1 giant cave that's all in one layer, all connected, 2 caves, or a circle cave, sort of like the circle world. So this will be connected all the way around. We'll stick with just the random. And then the couple tweaks. So rivers, if rivers are in place, rivers usually make traversal of armies a little trickier. There are certain traits that armies can have. Certain nations will be able to more easily traverse rivers. Other nations will have to go around the river or come up with some sort of a capability onto their armies that allows them to easily pass rivers. And during winter or anytime there's cold weather, scales, we'll get to that, rivers will freeze over, allowing anyone to cross over. So this is, I've never played without rivers. I think it's kind of an important part of, map strategy and things like that. They also make surrounding provinces a bit richer, so that helps. And then wraparound. So this, if you don't have any wraparound, it's just one map. It will look like this image, So, a nation that's going to be on the left side will have really no connection whatsoever with the right side. Whereas if there's an east-west wraparound, then just to the left of this left side will be the right side. So it wraps around. And on many maps, that makes it a much more fair and balanced experience. So that no nation is kind of stuck in the middle and gets surrounded by all other nations. Essentially, everyone is in the middle, sort of. And then you can also do north-south or both. Both tends to be a bit kind of confusing, especially at the start of a game, of like where kind of your borders are and where you might want to be protecting. And it's just kind of just a big splotch of land everywhere. I think the most common that people play with is just east-west, so we'll go with that. For the donut world, the circle world, it doesn't matter too much. But, we'll put it in. Okay, and we'll call this game tutorial. Then you get offered the selection of your era. And this is going to determine pretty much the nation availability, as well as certain default rules for like map generation. And so you're told that the early ages are full of magic, civilization is at its beginning. Most places, iron has not been thought of yet, armor and weapons are made of wood, stone, and bronze. Mages are most powerful in this age, and there's an abundance of magic resources. It's a time of legends. There's certain aspects of that are not, I think, entirely accurate, most notably mages being most powerful. I think that's sort of... It's somewhat true, I suppose. It is somewhat true. Middle Ages, iron is now available to most nations. Mages have lost some of their former power, and magic resources are not as abundant as before. And then Late Ages, iron and steel are readily available. Magic resources have continued to dwindle, but mages have become more organized, and their knowledge of the different magic paths are greater than ever before. There's no wrong answer of like what age to start with, or what age is best, or what age people enjoy the most. I can tell you, based on the discussions that I've looked into and things like that, it does seem pretty clear that late age is the least popular. Because people do like having a lot more mage stuff, magic resources. The early ages tend to have a lot more mythological creatures in them compared to late age. And late age also tends to just have a lot of heavily armored units, and a lot of blood magic is actually pretty prevalent in late age, which is a whole different ball of worms that we really don't want to get into. So I would say early and middle are definitely more common. Between those, there's not a massive difference in how the game is going to play. But we're going to go with middle age specifically for this tutorial, but do not feel, bothered or worried about going into early age or even going into late age, but we're going to go with middle. Okay, so then you're going to have your participants, the AI and things like that that are going to be in the game. For your first game, I heavily suggest just going with easy AI, because the difficulty with your first game, especially, even after watching this video, is going to be in figuring out the mechanics of the game, how things work together, and how to just create troops and defeat like the independent armies that are going to be around the map. Once you get a hand on all that, then you can deal with messing with the AI. So we could even go into changing the AI type, which allows you to set them to like standard AI, defensive, or aggressive. And we could just put them all on defensive. This is the easiest settings. But again, your first game, you're just trying to figure out how things work. That's it. Because that's going to give you the best odds for having a strong foundation of just moving forward and then adding on to all that knowledge. And eventually, you're beating multiple mighty AI and all that sort of stuff. But just figure out the mechanics first. Don't worry about, I got to prove myself by playing against hard AI or something like that. I will also mention here, this is a pretty important thing, especially as you're learning, and I'm not going to go over this too much going forward, but on almost any screen of the game, if you hit the question mark button on your keyboard, so that's the shift backslash question mark, it'll bring up a hotkey screen, which will show you all the available hotkeys for that given screen, whether you're on the world map or on a submenu or something like this. And hotkeys are going to be pretty important if you're going to be putting dozens and dozens of hours into the game, because you're going to be doing a lot of things kind of repetitively, many actions over and over and over. You're going to be opening up the same screens over and over and over. Hotkeys will cut down on that kind of time a lot. So when setting up AI here, it's a small time saver, because you're not going to do this too often, but that's just the general tip. The question mark, shift question mark, whatever you want to call it, will bring up your hotkey screen. All right. So one of the hotkeys we can use is to set all the AI. You can actually go in, they're set on random for now, so a random nation available. You can go in and actually pick the nation that you want them to play as. Or you can set it to a random land nation or a random water nation. But you can also do Shift L, and that will set them all to a random land nation if you don't want to play with any water stuff. And for this game, we're not going to do anything with water nations. And water nations are not like fundamentally different. They're not like, whoa, this is like a completely different game now that I'm playing a water nation. It's more just for the sake of, especially for a learning game, it makes it a little tricky when you have to defend not only your land borders from your neighbors, but then you also have to worry about enemies coming from the sea. So we're just going to skip over that. You can worry about that later. All right, so then for our nation that we're going to be playing, as you can see, there are a lot of nations in the game. I believe there are 102 total between the three ages. The early age has the most choices, I think, and then middle age, and then late age. And they're all pretty different. And I'm not going to sit here for 20 minutes and go over all the different nations and all the things available to you, because I'm certain you will do that on your own. And I encourage it to take a look at all these very interesting and fun nations. Dominions is a fantasy game. So these are all very fantasy nations, but it's somewhat unique in that it borrows a lot from real-world mythology and real-world history. And so you'll have nations that are sort of inspired by Greek mythology or Roman history or Norse mythology, Egyptian, all sorts of Aztec. There's loads of different options depending on what you're interested in. We're going to specifically be going with Ulm, which is kind of the go-to beginner nation due to various reasons we'll get into. But Ulm is not super mythologically based in any sort of, specific country, I suppose. They're basically the equivalent of dwarves in the game. But yeah, I would encourage you to look through some nations, see what you're interested in. I will give some guidelines if you don't want to pick Ulm, as we will, and if you want to pick a different nation that you might be more interested in. There's just a couple things. There are certain nations that are going to be more heavily reliant on magic, and for your first 1 or 2 games or something like that, being more magic reliant is going to make the game trickier for you, rather than being more just troop reliant, which is what Ulm is. Ulm is very just heavily based on its strong infantry. And so picking a nation that's much more magically focused is going to be tougher for you. And then and how you're going to tell that is pretty much going to be based on continuing to watch this video, because we're going to go over units and how to look at a unit and try to understand all the different attributes of a unit, and if it's a strong infantry or you know, it's not a strong infantry, things like that. So once you have an understanding of what makes a unit good in certain ways or bad in certain ways, you'll be able to look at a nation, look at its roster of units, and then determine, okay, I see that this thing does not have super strong troops, and then it's obvious that it's going to have stronger mages to sort of balance it out. So you'll be able to figure that out after this video. And the other thing to specifically watch out for is going to be anything related to blood. Blood magic is much more complicated than even normal magic, which is already pretty complicated. And even 400 hours into the game, I'm still not super comfortable getting blood magic up and going and running a blood economy and all that. So if you look at any nation, and again, you can just right click on any nation to take a look. And that'll give you some lore information. That'll give you the national features and running down what its sort of magic capabilities are, its military, things like that. And we'll go over all this with Ulm. But anytime you see the word blood mentioned, especially under the magic section here, that's sort of a bit of a red flag. Especially if it's the first term next to magic. That means that they are very blood reliant. If it's just mentioned at the end and it's not a super important part of the nation, you probably can slip by and run it without that. If I have an example here of one where it's just sort of mentioned. So here, Vanheim, you see it mentions air, glamour, earth, and then blood. And you can run this nation, probably, especially against easy AI, without really getting involved with blood at all. Like, you could probably completely ignore it. The third thing that you might want to not dive straight into, pun intended, is the water nations, which are placed at the bottom of the list conveniently. So for Middle Age, that's East, Pelagia, Oceania, Atlantis, and Earlier. The problem is that their troops tend to be a little bit weaker, especially on land. It's like they're probably going to have big control over the ocean, but eventually they will have to break onto land, and it sometimes can be a lot harder for them compared to a land-based nation, because a land-based nation almost never has to break into the ocean. So perhaps save those for a little bit later. But all right, we're going to be taking a look at Ulm. And Ulm has, as I said, very strong troops, very strong infantry. They kind of rely on their superiority of steel compared to everyone else. In late age, steel and heavy armor and all that is a lot more common, but in middle age, it's not so much. And so Ulm has that as their specific advantage, that they have basically some of the best troops that you can make in this era. Where they lack, however, is sort of twofold, and that's in their magic and that's in their priests. But their troops are so strong, especially just against easy AI learning the game, that you can almost entirely just ignore magic and still win. And so that's why it's generally recommended as like the newbie faction for learning the game. So we're not going to go over the lore because I don't want to take up the time. You can read that on your own. And we're just going to go over the national features and what everything means. So we see that it's a race of stocky humans. Like I said, they're kind of the dwarf equivalent, but they are humans. They have a production bonus in all castles. We'll get to what that means. Military consists of heavy infantry, crossbows, knights with superior armor. So, yeah, that's what they're known for. Their magic consists of earth magic, fire magic, and rarely air and astral. There are 8 paths of magic. So there's fire, water, air, earth. Those are the elemental magics. And then there's astral, nature, glamour, and blood. And those are the other 4 sorcery elements, or sorcery paths. So there's 8 paths. Ulm does have decent numbers in 2 of those 8, and they get a little bit in 2 more. But again, they're not really a magic-focused nation, but we will be utilizing their mages. They also have superior magic item forging. So they are basically the best in the business at making magic items. And those we'll get into later, of course. But those are going to be pretty useful. And it is... Again, you could probably beat a game pretty easily with Ulm without ever making a single magic item. That I wouldn't say is necessary either. But we'll talk about magic items later. And then their smith's research is not affected by drain scale. And we'll get to that when we talk about scales in a second. But it's another thing that just sort of means that really Ulm is very much not a magical nation. And so they're so kind of not in need of magic or that interested in magic that even without like the essence of magic in their nation, they can still research stuff. Again, we'll get to what that means. They have weak priests. And they have inquisitors. Talk about that in a second. Scales and blesses. And then standard forts. Master masons can build better forts, and their forts produce 25% more resources. We'll get to all this stuff. All right, so the roster. It's divided into 2 sections, and there are 2 types of units in the game. There are units, which are the ones mostly that do the actual fighting on a field. You know, you have infantry, you have archers. That's all just units. And then you have commanders. Units cannot move around the map on their own. They cannot go into battle on their own, really. I mean, they can some, but anyways, to move around the map and to attack and all that sort of stuff, they have to be led by a commander. So they have to be put into a squad that's led by a commander. So your commanders are sort of the things that are mostly moving around the map, and they will often have units under their command. But commanders can break into, sort of fall into several different categories. Mages are one category that obviously do magic spells, they do magical research, they can forge magic items, and they can cast magical rituals. So mages are very important, and even in a nation like Ulm, which, as I've emphasized, is not a very magical nation, we will be making plenty of mages and utilizing them. Priests. Priests are going to be mainly involved with a mechanic called Dominion, a very important mechanic, as the game's title would imply, and we'll talk about that later, but they can build temples for you to help spread your dominion, and they can also bless some of your special units in combat, which is a very powerful effect. So, thankfully, we have weak priests, but our most important mage unit that we're going to be making is also a priest. So he combines both roles into one, which is pretty handy. Then there's military commanders, and these are going to be the ones primarily leading your troops into battle. They will have the largest capacity for how many units they can sort of command at one time. So they're pretty important for most nations. Then there's certain other roles that kind of, there's some specialized roles such as a scout or an assassin or like a master mason. There's certain things that don't quite fall into those other 3 categories. So let's start just looking at what all these stats mean for each unit. And we'll start by looking at our spy. So this is one of the special types of commanders. Even though he's called a commander, he can't actually command any units. He can't lead any units into battle ever. He's a special one of those 4th types that is meant to be a scout. And so he's meant to go around the map on his own, hiding from prying eyes. He won't get into any fights that you don't want him to get into. And he can reveal the fog of war, and he can seek out where the enemies are and see sort of the lay of the land, stuff like that. But we're going to go over just all the attributes here that are listed on the screen, because there is a lot. And there's a lot. And it's very important that you understand the basics of what all these different things mean, because every commander and every unit is going to have pretty much all these stats. So once you understand all these, that's going to allow you to then basically analyze all the other nations and all their roster in order to figure out what is what and what works with what. Okay, so along the top, first three things here, you have gold, resources, and recruitment points. This is the currencies required to make one of these units. So gold is gold. You're going to accumulate gold mainly through gaining new provinces, gaining new territory. You're going to get an income of gold from all your provinces every round. And that will accumulate over time until you spend it. So, you know, to make one of these units costs 80, or to make one of these scouts, spies, this costs 80 gold. And that comes out of your treasury, you spend it, it's gone. Additionally, pretty much there are exceptions, of course, but most units will then cost upkeep. And so that you have to spend every round as long as they're on the map. As long as they exist, every round you have to pay for their upkeep. And if for some reason you can't pay upkeep for a certain amount of units, they will desert and they will leave. So you have to keep in mind the upkeep. And I believe the upkeep is... Oh, see, this is what I was worried about, is that I was going to come up to something that I didn't have an immediate answer for. I believe it's the annual upkeep. So across 12 turns is going to be about 80% of the gold cost. So 80% of 80 gold will be the upkeep over 12 turns, which is a full year of the game. Because every turn is a month. So, you know, over however many turns, at 15 turns or something like that, you'll pay the full gold cost again just to have him on the map, to have him in existence. And so some units can cost a lot, especially the commanders. You can get mages or military commander, high-end stuff that costs 300, 400, 500, 600. I mean, there are certain commanders that cost like 900 gold. And so if you have a lot of those, especially if you just keep building mages and mages and mages, that upkeep does keep adding up. And if you're not keeping your income up, you know, if you're not taking new provinces, or if you're actually losing provinces to enemies, you can really get screwed by how much upkeep you have. It's not really something that's going to prevent you probably from picking certain commanders or something like that, but it is an important thing to keep in mind. Okay, so gold, you accumulate, you spend. Pretty simple. It's like many other games. Resources, however, are going to be quite a bit different, because resources do not accumulate. You do not have a pool of resources that you're going to just stack up and up and up and up and then spend it. So it's different than gold. Resources are accumulated based on the province where you're trying to build these units, such as inside a fort. And any resources that were generated that turn by that province that are not spent on units or commanders are lost. So they're not something that you need to worry about and like, oh, I shouldn't spend these resources because I need them. You should not feel worried about spending all the resources available to you. Like that should not be part of the decision of whether or not you should make an extra unit or not. So spend all the resources you can. But certain units, certain commanders will cost a lot more resources. And that might be a bottleneck for you for wanting more heavily armored troops or something like that. Because usually armor and weapons is what mainly contributes to the resource cost. And as you can imagine, Alm's units, by and large, have very high resource costs. So resources are very important to us. Then there's recruitment points. Similar to resources, they don't accumulate over time, so they're either spent or they're thrown away at the end of the turn. So again, don't feel bad about spending the recruitment points. but it is potentially another bottleneck. Certain units might cost a lot of recruitment points to throw into your recruitment pile, and it might end up being a bottleneck where you can't get a certain amount of units because you run out of recruitment points. And we'll go over what contributes to how many recruitment points you have available or not. Okay, so those all three, pretty much every unit you're going to recruit on a province is going to cost those three in differing amounts depending on the unit or commander. Certain you can also summon units. We'll get into that much later. You can also summon units magically. Those are not going to cost these resources. Those will cost different resources, but they might still have an upkeep of gold. Okay, then into the actual attributes. First, we have hit points. It's pretty obvious. Hit points, once you hit 0, generally the unit dies. So that's that. I mean, it's not very complicated. Now, I will tell you, for pretty much all the things we're going to be talking about from here on out, the next, like, 10 things we talk, or the next, except for size, pretty much everything else we're going to be talking about, 10 is sort of the average number. So the average, just bog standard, human soldier of complete averageness has 10 in basically all these things we're going to be talking about. He'll have 10 hit points, 10 protection, 10 defense, 10 attack, all that. So if you consider 10 to be the universal kind of baseline, then you know if something is above average or below average in a certain category. So our spy has 12, so he's above average there a little bit. But certain units will have 14 hit points, 16, 18, 20, 50, 75, even 200. It's possible. But you know that for an average human soldier, 10 is average. Okay, next is size. Size contributes to two things mainly. One is the supply cost. We'll talk about supplies once we get into game. It's not that big of a mechanic. Generally, it's not something I ever really have to think about or worry about that much. But your units do consume a certain amount of supplies wherever they are every turn. This is not something you have to generate or anything. It's automatically generated based on the province they're in. But certain provinces can generate much less supplies. And if you have a lot of large size units in that province, or just many units, you might be limited by supply and your units will start to starve. Which is obviously kind of bad. But again, it's not that major of a thing that you're going to constantly be fretting about or something like that. And so the size is on a scale from 1 to 10, 3 being the size of a normal human, a horse being about size 5, and then, you know, very big things can be up to size 9 or 10. So the second thing that size determines is the actual space on the battlefield. The battlefield is broken up into a grid of squares. Each square on the battlefield can hold up to 10 size points. Meaning that the average, well, for humans, you can fit 3 humans onto a battlefield square. So they can fight 3 shoulder to shoulder in each square. So if you got humans against humans, there's going to be 3 targets fighting 3 targets, you know, square to square. Whereas if you have, say, cavalry, which is usually size 5, you're going to fit 2 to a square. And so if you're fighting cavalry against humans, there might be 3 on one side, 2 on the other. And that does have certain ramifications. Because say you have some hauberks, which are size 2. They're like hobbits. So you can fit 5 of those things into one square. And then say that goes up against like an elephant or something that's size, I don't know, whatever. It's 1 to a square. You could have 5 things fighting 1 elephant, and those 5 things are all swinging their weapons. You know, so you have 5 weapon swings versus the elephant's like 1 attack. Elephant's not a great example because it can just trample them, but you get my point. There is a difference, and attack density is what they call it, is how many attacks you might be able to push out of 1 square. That can be a deciding factor in a fight. You know, it is what it is. It's not really changeable. There are certain spells that might change size and certain effects, but it is what it is. It's just important. It's something to keep in mind when you're looking at all these different units, so you know what size is, and just, you know, 10 size points to a square. Protection. Protection is essentially your armor or your defense. It's the thing that reduces directly the damage that you take from an attack. So there's a lot of math in Dominions behind the scenes. There's a lot of dice rolls and everything like that. But if an attack goes through and an attack lands on you, for most of the time, the last thing that's going to happen is that you are going to have your protection lower the amount of the damage. And then whatever's remaining, if there is any remaining, that will go through to your hit points. And then you lose hit points. And one thing that's... So we can see that our spy here is obviously very unprotected. He's wearing leather cap, leather cuirass. So he has a very low protection score of 5. Remember, 10 is average. And so protection is usually generated by two things. It's going to be generated either by armor that the unit is wearing, in this case leather armor, or it's going to be generated by natural protection, which is like thick scales or hide or something like that. So obviously as a human, he has no natural protection. Humans are very soft and supple, but he is wearing armor. So you can see just his total protection value, and it is divided. It is separated between his body and his head, because those are two different things, and you can get hit in either, the body or the arms or the legs, which is all encompassed by body armor, or the head, which is different. So you might have certain units that have, body armor. They might have like plate armor on, but they don't have any helmets, and so they are vulnerable to any headshots from like arrows raining down or something like that. That might be a big vulnerability of them. But our spy is pretty unprotected overall. He's not really a combatant, as you would imagine. So he only has 5 protection. And if we look at his weapon here, and we skip ahead just a tad amount, and we look down at its damage of his broadsword, it's actually pretty high. Again, if you consider 10 to be almost the universal average here, he can swing for 17. And so if we had a spy fighting a spy and one of them landed a blow, 17 damage going through, that's a lot. That is a lot of damage. He only has 5 protection. Now, you might be thinking at this point that, oh, well, if I just had 18 protection, this broadsword would never hurt me. But therein lies the actual genius of how Dominions works. Because Dominions uses a system called the DRN, the Dominion's random number. And this impacts many, many different mechanics. And so when an attack goes through, you are not just having 17 as the damage number. You're actually having 17 plus a dice roll. And you're not just having 5 protection to protect against it, you're having 5 plus a dice roll. And the dice roll almost always is going to be what they call an open 2d6 or an exploding 2d6. And so this is going to be 2 6-sided dice that are rolled. And if either of them come up as a 6, or if any of them come up as a 6, what happens is the 1 is subtracted from that, so it drops down to 5. And then another 6-sided die is added to add on top of that. And if that comes up as 6, then you subtract 1, and you add another 6-sided die. And so that's why it's exploding, or that's why it's an open 2d6. So it can keep going, it can keep climbing up. But it also means that there's kind of a bell curve to the dice rolls. And so if you have, say, 12 damage against 12 protection, on average, that's not actually going to do any damage, because both of those things get a dice roll, and that's going to average out to, the 2d6 is going to average out to a 7. The exploding kind of fudges that a little bit, but yeah, I mean, on average, they're going to bell curve out to the same kind of number. And so, but the thing is, though, with the exploding, anything is theoretically possible. Because you're going to get that dice roll on your attack rolls, defense rolls, damage rolls, protection rolls, all this stuff. And so it is theoretically possible for a low-level militia with 10 damage, it is possible for him to one-shot a god. You know, in one sweeping blow of just, if all the stars align for dice rolls, you know, it can all come together, and so anything can happen due to the way the dice system is set up. The highest dice roll that I've actually observed, because I don't look at that many dice rolls, the highest that I've seen is a 36. Which means that quite a few sixes had to be rolled on that one hit. But I was watching a fight and I noticed that my guy got hit for like 30 damage. And I couldn't believe that where it even came from. So I had to dig into the numbers just to look. But yes, that is possible. And when you have dozens and dozens and dozens of troops, you know, all swinging and all rolling dice constantly, you're going to get these outliers that happen. And so that means that, you know, having 18 protection against a 17 hit, 17 damage hit, that in no way guarantees your safety, because there are going to be a lot of dice rolls. Your protection roll could be low and their damage could be high, and then, you know, but averages. And so the way that it's set up then is that every point of these attributes really matters quite a bit. And if you look online, you can find a probability chart for the DRN. And so because the attacker will have to often beat the defender's number in order to actually connect with something, because if you equal his protection roll, you're not going to do any damage. So you have to beat it by 1 to at least do 1 point of damage. And so if you have no difference in your numbers, so say you have 17 damage, they have 17 protection, and you want to do damage to them, and you're rolling, you actually have a 46% chance of dealing 1 point of damage. Because you have to beat their number. And so then, if you are actually below them by 1, say you have 16 damage and they have 17 protection, so you're down 1, you only have a 38% chance. And if you're down 2, you have a 30% chance. If you're down 4, you have an 18% chance. And so that's why every point is very significant. If you're up by 4, you have a 76% chance. And so you're going to find certain buffs, and we're going to be getting to these eventually. There are going to be certain buffs, you know, magical spells that you can buff your troops with that might increase their protection by 3. And that doesn't sound a whole lot, but, you know, you go from having them have a 46% chance to hit you or to deal damage to you to a 24%. And that's pretty significant. So, again, 10 is the average, but don't snub your nose at, say, if it's a 12 or a 13 or something like that. Like, it doesn't sound that much higher, but every point does matter quite a bit. Okay, so that's protection. It's used to defend against, you know, all weapon attacks and pretty much all or most magical damaging attacks as well. Protection is kind of the universal, most common limiter of the damage that your unit will take. All right, magic resistance. This is basically, if you're familiar with Dungeons and Dragons, this is like your saving throws. This is not usually used for any sort of damaging spells. You're not going to be using magic resistance to prevent damage from a fireball, for example. But you will use it to prevent being put to sleep or having some sort of debuff applied to you or something like that. Magic resistance is often going to be rolled for that. And again, all these things are always going to involve the DRN. So even if you have a very low MR magic resistance, you still have a chance to shrug off anything. But on average, you know, having a below average magic resistance will make you more susceptible to magical effects. Morale. This is a pretty important one as well, because much like real world armies, units are not likely to just fight to the death and fight till they're completely decimated and wiped out. You know, there's not going to be just a last man standing thing most of the time. And what's going to happen instead is that at a certain point, their morale will fail and they will actually rout. And so they'll try to flee off their side of the battlefield. And morale checks where your morale is checked and dice rolls are done to see if you rout, or happen at certain points. There are certain magical effects and different types of effects that can force morale checks in order to try to purposefully just quickly rout an enemy army or something like that. And then there are certain effects that with like your squads and your units and your army, then when they suffer losses, that's going to force morale checks. And so if you have a squad that's filled with like below average morale units, then they're much more likely to suffer, a reasonably small amount of losses, and then they're going to rout because they failed their morale check. Whereas if you have, they say, 16 morale or something on all the units in the squad, they're going to fight much longer and suffer much heavier losses before they decide that they've had enough and to rout. And again, this is all dice rolls, and it's all averages, so some things could happen where a squad routs quicker than normal, or maybe they fight for longer than normal. It's all hard to say based on dice rolls, but average morale is 10. So below that, that's going to be a vulnerability for that unit, for that squad, for that army, so on and so forth. And above that, they're a bit stronger. They can, in their willpower of fighting on. And there's also just sort of, aside from morale, I believe the rule is that if you lose 75% of your army, and I believe that's by HP hit points, totals, things like that, then every remaining unit will rout, regardless. I believe that's the rule. Feel free to double check that, but I'm pretty sure that's true. Or maybe it might be 50%, not 75%. It's a certain number. So that's why if you fill your army with just a lot of sort of low quality units, what they call chaff, basically just like average militia, things like that, that's really doesn't have high protection or high defense and just has 10 hit points or something like that, and they just get decimated, that might force the rest of your army, even if they're really good and they're strong, they haven't died, it might force them all to rout anyways. And so that has less to do with morale and more to do with just overall quality of units and keeping that in mind with just your whole army composition. Okay. Strength. Strength generally contributes directly to your weapon damage. And so most weapons, physical, actual weapons, say if we look at the broadsword, we can see that it has a base damage value of 6, and then we have 11 strength, so that equals 17. Like, it's a pretty simple formula there. There are certain weapons that will not use all of your strength. It might be only half of your strength that's added to the weapon damage, or a third of your strength added to the weapon damage. And then two-handed weapons will actually add 125% of your strength. So, yeah, strength is the biggest factor for just determining how much damage your weapons will do. It also contributes to your siege strength and siege defense. So if you're trying to break down an enemy fort, or if you're trying to defend a fort, that is a factor. But, that's certainly a secondary consideration. Attack. This is the biggest factor in determining whether or not you actually land a hit. Because every time you swing, you're going to have to roll your attack skill against the enemy's defense skill to determine if you land a hit. And this is talking in melee specifically. So attack skill is for melee weapons, not ranged weapons. So weapons will also generally have some sort of attack modifier. The broadsword has an attack of +1, so a total of 11 here. And so if we have our guy here attacking another spy of the same type, that would be 11 attack versus his 11 defense, and means that he'll miss 46% of the time, because you have to beat the enemy defense. So every point matters on average, but anything is possible. You can hit any amount of defense theoretically. But on average, an attack skill of 12 will beat a defense skill of 11. that's pretty. It's not a super complicated thing, but there are a lot of things that will affect attack and defense. And since every point matters, even a swing of 2 in different directions can make a big difference when you're just talking about, on average, on the battlefield between hundreds of troops. So defense, same thing. Just, yep, can be modified by weapons. The broadsword also adds 1 defense, so you're kind of pairing with it, so that adds to your defense number, and that is checked with that. Precision is the attack skill for ranged weapons. So this includes things like bows or slings, but also it includes spell casting. Any sort of ranged spells will generally use precision to determine if they land where you want them to land. We'll talk about arrows and ranged combat later. And I know this video is already long, and we haven't even gotten into the game, but again, this is the most important stuff, I think, for just understanding everything that makes up the combat, which is the most important part of Dominions, and what makes a unit a unit. So I know I'm kind of getting bogged down here, but this is really important stuff. So all you need to know is that precision is the key factor of determining where the shots land on the field. It does not determine if it hits something in the square, just it determines if it lands in the square you want it to, rather than like in your own troops or something like that. So a high precision is important for range units and mages and things like that to actually accurately land shots in certain squares. Then we have combat speed. This is how many squares per round of combat that the unit can move on average. So the battlefield, I think, is about 100 squares long. So it would take the spy about 9 rounds or so to traverse the entire battlefield from left to right. 10 is average. Cavalry is going to have stuff like 24 or 28 combat speed, so they're going to be able to race to the other side pretty quickly. Certain units, very heavily armored units, will have much lower combat speed, 7 or 6 combat speed, and they'll be shuffling across the field much slower. Map move is their speed when traversing across the map. This is there's a lot of different modifiers and numbers involved in how many sort of tiles, provinces you can move with any given turn. But a higher map move obviously is going to enable you to move much further. But there's things like the terrain, moving through forests or across mountains, through mountains or things like that. Or if there's snow on the ground, that's going to slow most units down. Stuff like that. But again, 10 is average. Up to 16 is definitely above average. But you can always, no matter what, assuming you have a passable connection, you can move 1 province per turn, no matter what, even with a map move of 1. But there are certain units, certain commanders, certain things like that do have a map move of 0. They cannot move without some sort of magical assistance. Encumbrance. Encumbrance and fatigue. So we'll talk about fatigue first. Fatigue is a pretty important mechanic, and a lot of things, especially a lot of magic spells and stuff, can actually cause fatigue. And the reason that it's pretty important is because for every 10 points of fatigue that a unit gets or generates or takes or whatever, their defense skill will be lowered by 1 until they have recovered that fatigue. So at 10 fatigue, your defense goes down by 1. At 20, it's down by 2, so on and so forth. And it can go up to 200. So the more fatigue you generate, the easier you are to hit, generally. Additionally, for every 20 fatigue you generate, your attack skill goes down by 1. So you become less effective in combat on the offensive front as well. At 100 fatigue, your unit will actually go unconscious, and they cannot do anything. And it also makes them much more likely to be essentially critically hit, or they call it an armor defeating hit, which will cut through automatically 25% of your protection. So at 100 fatigue, not only will your defense be down by 10, you can't attack, you can't defend yourself really in any way, you also will be just probably losing 25% of your protection with every hit that's landed on you. So fatiguing out, or getting 100 plus fatigue, is really almost a death sentence for most units. The most common way that fatigue is generated is through encumbrance. Encumbrance is the number of fatigue that the unit is going to generate every time they attack with their weapon. Or if they're using multiple weapons, then for every weapon they have. And so this unit, every time he swings his broadsword in combat, he will generate 3 fatigue, which is a relatively low number, as we're going to see when we look at our heavier troops. Some of them will generate 7 or 8 fatigue every turn when they're swinging their weapons, and that will add up pretty quickly, because you only remove 1 fatigue every round. So if this guy just kept swinging, he would generate 3 fatigue every turn and relieve 1 fatigue. So he would kind of just keep building up by 2. It would take him a while to get to 100, but he would eventually get there. Once you hit 100 plus fatigue, you actually remove 5 fatigue per round until you drop below 100 again. So you sort of usually pretty quickly recover from being 100 plus fatigue most of the time, but there are certain situations, certain conditions that will generate a lot more, because spell casting also generates fatigue. Every spell you cast will generate a certain amount of fatigue. That's going to be listed on the spell itself, but then there's also, if you are wearing armor and things like that, you also generate additional amount of spellcasting fatigue or encumbrance. So this guy, if he managed to cast a spell, he would also generate 3 from that. But that means that you can't just throw the heaviest armor you want on your mages, because they will very, very quickly generate a lot of fatigue and go unconscious. If you manage to go over 200 fatigue, there's another complicated formula, but basically you have a chance or potentially a guarantee to just start taking HP damage from high amounts of fatigue. So there are certain spells you can cast that generate like 300 fatigue, or something, or 2, they just generate a lot of fatigue from one spell casting that can really potentially just kill you if you cast them under bad conditions. But yeah, so for most of our units though, the most thing we have to care about is the just encumbrance, the fatigue they're going to be generating every round they swing their weapon. Then we have age. Most of the time you don't really have to worry about this. Unit will have, every unit pretty much will have an age, and if you click on this, it'll show you their max age. That is not the age in which they just die. That is the age at which they will start to receive age penalties, which can affect their attack, defense, precision, encumbrance, hit points, combat speed, map move, and get progressively worse. And they will also start to get affected by various afflictions, such as like suddenly losing an eye spontaneously or getting diseased. So there are, most of the time, you will not have to worry about this unless you're playing some very long games with some very long-lived units that just keep going over turn over turn. Most of the time, you don't have to worry about it, because a whole 12 turns is 1 year. So this guy can play, for 28 years before he has to worry about getting penalties. But there are plenty of units that will actually start above their max age. And so that's a consideration, in that they will already kind of start with penalties and maybe start to get afflictions. That is a problem for them, and it's usually kind of in exchange for some benefits elsewhere. But for most times, in most units, you don't have to worry about age. Then we have XP. Every unit will generate, I believe, 1 XP per month, as long as they just exist on the map. But usually you're going to be generating XP through combat. And I don't have the numbers exactly off the top of my head, but I'm pretty sure the max XP you can get is 100. And there, at certain points, you will get benefits for having a certain amount of XP. So at certain points, you'll get an increased attack skill. You might get an increased defense skill. You might get an increased strength. Morale. I think mages actually can get increased research points. Things like that. So if you have some long-lived units, some powerful units, they might eventually get multiple levels of XP and just become better and even harder to kill. Then we have leadership. And we're going to actually go to we'll look at one of our military commanders. So here's a commander of Ulm. So there are 3 different types of leadership. There's regular leadership, which refers to living creatures, normal, just living creatures like soldiers. Then there's magic leadership. This is for magical beings, such as, if you were leading a troop of unicorns or of dragons, or all things like that. And there'll be a certain trait that will designate them as a magical being. So those have to be led by specific commanders that can lead magic creatures. And then there's undead, which also counts for demons. So undead and demons have to be led by someone that can lead undead and demons, which is this third thing. The number associated with it is how many of that unit type that they can lead. So this guy can lead 100 living units, 100 soldiers, 100 whatever, 100 wolves or something like that. The sort of most basic commander that you might come across, as far as a military commander is concerned, will probably be able to lead about 75 living units. 100 is generally what you want to shoot for. That's sort of like a good, nice, average military commander. Anything above that, like 125 or 150 even, is pretty sort of high-end commanders. I think we might have one. No, we have just all 100. So yeah, 100 is perfectly reasonable. But, you might have 300, 400 troops, so you might need multiple military commanders in one army in order to just handle that amount of units. You'll also notice underneath this little flag, there might be some stars. So say we look at our Black Acolyte, he can lead 10 living units, but he has no star under there. Whereas all our military commanders have a gold star. And I'm pretty sure this just corresponds automatically to how many units they can lead. So 100 just gets a gold star. 125 plus usually gets 2 gold stars, or maybe even 3 is possible. And then 75 leadership is a silver star. Below that is going to be no stars. Those stars mainly correspond to morale bonuses. So a 75 leadership guy with just a silver star will have no morale bonus or penalty. Anything below that, like if we wanted to use our Black Acolyte to lead 10 units, he would actually have a morale penalty to his units of -1. Whereas a gold star is actually a morale bonus of +1. And then if you have 3 gold stars or something like that, it's +3 morale. So having good quality military commanders does help. They can lead more units, and they can lead them with a stronger morale so they don't rout as easily. So usually you're going to want to shoot for 100 with a gold star, but it depends on what's available to you. And for different things like magic or undead, you might not have that luxury, things like that. Right. I think that's basically it. The last thing that I want to talk about, I guess, is the actual weapons and armor. So if we look at the hammer here that this commander is wielding, it's length 1. And this is the weapon length. It usually is going to be any number between 0 and 5. 1 is going to be, 0 is going to be sort of like natural attacks like claws or biting. 1 is going to be things like maces, swords, axes. That's usually going to be 1. 2 is sort of less common. That might be reserved for like great swords or battle axes. I think if we look at this guy is a maul, so that's going to be length 2. And then 3 is going to be reserved for like spears or like halberds. That'll be length 3. Above that is actually going to be pretty rare. We actually have pikeneers that have length 5. I don't think I've ever seen higher than 5. I don't think that exists. And weapon length really serves pretty much just, it serves a couple purposes, but the main purpose is in repelling. And so whenever 2 units meet and they attack one another, or one tries to attack the other, their weapon lengths are going to be compared. And if one side has a longer weapon, then that allows them to make a repel attempt against the other. So say we had this guy, this commander with length 1 hammer, and he was attacking this guy with the length 3 black halberd. When that attack is about to happen, the halberd wielder will get to make a repel attempt. And so this involves 2 dice rolls, or possibly 2 dice rolls. The first is going to be the repellers, the halberd wielders' attack, versus the hammer wielders, the attackers' defense. So the roles are kind of flipped there. So he basically gets to make like a counter attack. So he's rolling his attack versus the attacker's defense. If he succeeds, then the one that was trying to make the attack, that has now been possibly repelled, has to make a morale check. And that morale check is going to be modified by how much the repeller beat their defense. So very high attack numbers with long weapons, such as this Lord Guardian, are actually very good at repelling. And if the Lord Guardian here was being attacked by a lot of like lower quality units that had low defense and low morale, he might very rarely get hit because he's going to be constantly repelling. And so if they fail the morale check after their defense has been beaten by the attacker, or by the attack roll, if they fail the morale check, they do not get to make an attack. And so it basically just shuts down the entire attack. Additionally, I believe the after the attack and defense are compared, if the repeller wins, so the attacker made the attacker lost the defense roll, and so they now have to make a morale roll. The repeller, the one doing the repelling, also just gets to make a regular attack against them, like an actual counterattack. So they roll another attack, and if they beat their defense again, they get to roll their damage, but that damage is only going to ever do 1 damage max. So they get to do like a little bit of a poke, potentially. But the main feature of repelling is not the poke so much as just the preventing of the attack. So long weapon plus high attack versus low defense, low morale means a lot of repelling. But if you have a length 3 weapon and you only have 10 attack, you're probably not going to be repelling that much stuff. And against enemies, if they also have length 3 weapons, because the repeller has to have a longer weapon for it to count. And so conversely, you know, if you have a length 1 weapon and you have low defense and low morale, you will have a tough time hitting a lot of things. But fortunately, you know, length 1 weapons are pretty universal, pretty common. But against independent armies, actually, spears are pretty common as well. So it's something to keep in mind, the whole repelling thing. Then the last thing I want to talk about... Oh, well, no. Slightly ahead of myself. Now that we're over an hour. I'm not going as quickly as I'd like, but there's just so much to talk about. So, damage types is one of the last things I want to talk about. Basically, every weapon is going to have one or more of 3 different types. So there's slashing damage, there's piercing damage, and there's bludgeoning damage. Slashing damage will actually be increased. The number you roll will be increased by 25% after the protection roll is done. So if you do any amount of damage to the target, it's going to be bumped up by 25% if you do slashing. It's also more likely to chop off body parts, but the main feature you're looking at is that extra 25% as long as you beat their protection. Piercing will reduce the protection of the target by 15% as part of the damage roll. So they'll get the benefit of 15% less protection. And then bludgeoning, that will only specifically do something on head hits. And I don't want to get into all the specifics of like the numbers and the math involved of whether you hit the body or the head or anything, because there is a bunch involved with that due to like size and weapon length and blah blah blah. But if you manage to roll into a head hit, the damage will be increased by 25% before armor is deducted. So you can really increase the damage on a head hit, which is nice, but it's only a random chance that you actually hit the head. And it's not a super high chance most of the time. Okay, so those are the three different kind of universal types for weapons. And if a weapon has one type, it'll always be of that type. If it has two types, it's going to randomly choose between one of the two types with every hit. So you can't really guarantee it. It's just, you know, this one will do piercing sometimes, it'll do bludgeoning other times. So you might get a head hit and it won't be a bludgeoning hit or a blunt damage hit. So, you know, there's no real telling. I will say that generally slashing is considered kind of the best damage type. Because usually you want to just do the most amount of damage after protection is considered. And it also can cut off arms and cut off heads and things like that. So I think slashing is generally the best, but you know, you don't necessarily have to let that sway your decision because there's a lot of factors. All right, the actual last thing I want to talk about here is shields. So if we go look at the armor, you see that armor has different protection values. It has different defense modifiers and different encumbrance values. So this is all kind of calculated into your numbers. So your protection here, his is 23, which is very, very high, obviously. And so that comes from his head being 23, his body armor being 23. The defense, those numbers are going to correspond to your defense value. So heavy armor makes you less defensible. Defense is kind of a misnomer. Like, it really is almost more like a dodge skill, because defense determines whether or not you completely avoid an attack. So heavy armor makes you less likely to completely avoid attacks. And then encumbrance. So this commander has 8 encumbrance for every time he swings his weapon, which is quite high. Then we have the tower shield. So this has a protection value as well. It has a defense value as well. It has encumbrance as well. But then it also has this, the parry value. And so how shields work is that whenever you're attacked, the attack is compared against your defense, but it's compared against your base defense without the shield parry value, and then sort of the parry, the value with the shield. So basically, if we look at our guys' defense numbers, he has a base of 11. His weapon makes it -2 to 9, and then his armor and shield actually drop it down significantly to 3. So without the shield parry value, he's actually at 3 defense, which is really bad. But with the shield parry value of +7, he's at 10 total. So if the attack were to land between, if it were to land on 11 or higher, say, and again, we're ignoring kind of the dice rolls, but if it were to land on 11 or higher, it would just be a hit, right? It would hit him. He wouldn't get the benefit of the shield in any way, and it would go against his 23 protection. If it landed on 2 or below, it would completely avoid him. So it wouldn't go to a protection. It would just, that would be the end of the attack. If, however, it lands between 3 and 10, which is the values that are modified due to his parry value, then it hits the shield. And in that case, you actually are going to have the damage first go to the shield's protection value. So you're going to compare the damage versus 19. If any of that damage then manages to still be left over after that 19 protection value, it then goes to your regular protection value. So in this case, if he doesn't have a high defense even with the parry, but if any of those hits land on his shield, it's going to be very, very hard to actually damage this guy. But unfortunately, his defense is only 10 even with the shield, so it is still quite possible to avoid the shield entirely and just go against the 23 protection, which is still really high. But that's how shields work. They're also very important for protecting from archers. And again, I don't want to get into it because I still have a lot to go over, but when an arrow lands in your unit's square, it's going to sort of check against the kind of biggest factor on whether or not it hits you is the shield or the size points in the square. So the attack roll for if it once the arrow lands in your square, right? Like that's already been decided. That's based on precision and everything like that. Once it lands in your square, whether or not it actually hits and goes through to check against your protection is based on the size points in the square plus a DRN roll. That's it. It's very simple. Precision is no longer involved. The defense roll is just a flat 2 minus any, like, there's a malus, there's a penalty if you have a lot of fatigue, so you might be even lower than 2 already, plus a DRN. So by default, with no shield and size 3, for example, you're already likely to get hit with an arrow and actually have it go against your protection. However, that's where shields come in, because shields get to add on to that 2 number that you get as your defense roll with their parry value times 2. So instead of rolling 2 plus DRN, the Commander of Ulm would actually be rolling 14 plus 2 plus the DRN, making them very likely to at least have the arrow go through their shield first. Because again, the arrow, the parry value times 2, if the roll falls within the parry range, it hits the shield. Otherwise, it avoids entirely. So most likely, it's going to hit the shield. But that's okay, because arrows generally are not going to break through 19 protection plus 23 protection. So shields are really, like, extremely important for protecting from arrow fire. But they are also important in melee combat. To a degree. Okay. So that's pretty much everything you'd need to know when actually evaluating different units, because you could then look at all these units here and see what makes them different, see what makes them strong, what makes them weak, where they kind of lack, things like that. So if we looked at over all our units, you can see like our Black Plate Infantry here. They have a relatively low gold cost of 10, they have a relatively low recruitment point cost of 9, but they have a very high resource cost of 43. They have above average hit points. They have extremely above average protection of 23. They have a slightly below average MR of 9, magic resistance. Slightly above average morale of 11. And then, pretty average attack, defense, precision. They have 11 strength, but they're also slow, 6 combat speed compared to the average of 10. And they have high encumbrance of 8. So they will generate a lot more fatigue if a combat goes on for a while. And they also have a slow map move of 8. So Ulm's armies are not known for really quickly zipping around the map. Right. And then we do want to get into a game, but this was the main thing I wanted to just get through in this video, because I really think it's important to understand what all these things mean, to help you pick out nations, pick out units, build your armies, and all that. Mages, because we should talk about mages. So this is like our most basic mage we can make, and he's gonna have all the usual stats. This guy even can lead living units. He can lead 60 of them. So in a pinch, he only has a silver star, but that's better than not having a star. So in a pinch, he can wield it. There's one other aspect of leadership that we'll talk about once we get in game. But, he can lead units if need be, and 30 magic units. The main thing, though, that we want to talk about is your magic. And that's going to be the first few things here with these different icons. And so this guy comes in with level 1 fire magic and level 2 earth magic. And there are different levels of the 8 paths that you can reach. And if we look at a different guy, this example, for example, he only has level 1 earth magic, but he also has level 2 divine magic, or holy magic, or priest magic, whatever you want to call it. So there's also different levels of priests between, like, usually 1 to 3, whereas most of the paths are going to be between 1 to, like, on average, you'll really never see one above 4, except for your pretender god, who might get up to like 7, 8, or 9, depending. So with only level 1 fire, usually you can only cast like the most basic kind of fire spells. Whereas with level 2, you gain access to a lot more. And for my purposes, and usually how I play, I don't tend to value level 1 magic that strongly, especially if a mage only has level 1 magic. I think we had an example here of something like that. Yeah, so like the Black Priest. I wouldn't really count him as a strong mage, because he just has level 1 earth magic. But he has the level 2 holy magic, and that is quite valuable in its own right. But if he didn't have that and he just was a level 1 earth mage, I wouldn't value that too highly, because there's not a whole lot you can do with level 1 earth. There is something you can do to actually make them viable in combat, but we might get to that later. Right. So then there's also a question mark. This is a random magic skill. And so the number next to this is 0. And that means that on average, whenever you make these guys, they will not get a random magic skill. And if you click on that, you can see what the possible paths are, the level of them, and the chance. So whenever you make one of these commanders, these mages, they'll always get level 1 fire, level 2 earth, and then they will have a 20% chance to get an additional +1 fire, air, earth, or astral. So you might have some, most of the ones you're going to make, 80% of the ones you're going to make are going to have level 1 fire, level 2 earth. But then you might have some, certain few, lucky ones, that have, say, level 2 fire and level 2 earth. Or level 3 earth and level 1 fire. Or an air or an astral thrown in there as well. And so this is a way to really kind of diversify your magic capabilities. And you might have certain mages, even amongst, the same type of commander, the same type of mage, you have 20 of them. There might be a couple that can just do some things that the others can't because they have access to different magic. So it's important to always check that, but the number just means that on average, they will not get one. And I think if we... Yeah, again, Ulm doesn't really have strong mages, so I don't think I can show you one where it says 1. But a lot of the times, this will say... it'll just have a 1, and then you'll see it's a 100% chance to maybe get an extra fire, air, earth, or astral. All right. Next to that is going to be their research ability. So every mage is going to have some amount of research ability. This is most commonly just dictated by the number of levels they have in their different magic paths. And if you consider 10 to kind of be the average, you see our Master Smiths are slightly above there at 11. Magic research is the only way that you actually unlock new magic spells that your mages can cast, both in combat and out of combat. So with no research done, you can't cast almost any spells. Like, very, very few. So research is very important because you want magic spells. Even Ulm, we want magic spells. So research is going to be important. And so if you're looking at the roster... and you see that, you only have mages with low research ability, or you might have a lot of ones with low research ability, but you have one that's like really good, but he's really expensive in certain things, then, that might be a problem for you. You might require more mages to generate the amount of research that another nation might do much more readily. So we'll talk about research when we get to that, but yeah, it is important. Then we see a few traits, and we didn't really talk about traits yet, but a lot of units, a lot of commanders are going to have special traits. You can hover over these, you can click on them to see sort of a description. Unhindered Researcher means that they're not affected by drain or magic scales in any way. I think you're not affected by magic scales either way, but yeah, anyways. Resource bonus, so these guys, if they're in a province, will actually generate 10 extra resources if they're in a fort to help make new units that require high resources. And then a forge bonus, which makes them more efficient in forging magic items by reducing the cost in gems. And again, this all aligns with what we read about here. Okay. I think that's mostly all I want to talk about here, because we do want to get into game. Well, I might have to break this into 2 videos. I really didn't want to, but I just, yeah, I really underestimated just how much there is to say. And I'm trying to be as concise as possible, but I don't want to miss anything crucial. You can also see any special sites that you have. Usually these are just going to be in your capital spot, and they're just going to indicate kind of what units you can recruit there, and maybe any magic gems that you might generate for free. So our capital will produce 5 earth gems per turn. We'll talk about those later. But yes, you will have certain units that you can only make in certain locations, such as only at your capital, or maybe only in forests or something like that. So for here, you can see down here, the Guardian can only be recruited in our capital. We can't recruit him in any other fort we might have. Things like that. You know, our Priest Smith can only be recruited in our capital. Okay. So we're going to move on, because we're still not going to go into the game yet. There's still one more big thing to talk about, and that is your Pretender. This is your god. This is the god of your nation. The whole plot of Dominion's matches is that every nation, every player is sort of serving a specific pretender god. And the true god has died, and so all these pretender gods are vying for the throne to become the new true god. And so this is your deity, and this is going to be kind of the most important commander, the most important thing you have, and determines a number of extra effects and mechanics of how your nation operates. And so this is a complicated screen. There's quite a bit to go over. I'll try to go quickly here. The first thing you want to do is select the form of your pretender, or what they call the chassis. And so if you click on here, on the little image, you're going to get sent to this screen, which is very wild, very daunting. It's a very intimidating screen when you first roll this up, because it's kind of exciting. You see a lot of cool different forms, little, you know, dragons and giant snake gods and titans and things. But as for what actually to pick, that's a bit more complicated. You can just pick something that looks cool to you. There's nothing wrong with that, but I'll help you try to understand specifically why you might want one thing over the other. So the first thing you see is that they're divided into 4 sections: Dominion 1, 2, 3, and 4. This is going to determine, well, it determines sort of their general form. You can see sort of a delineation between each of the categories and how they're kind of represented. And so Dominion 1 is mostly going to be sort of like human mages, or you know, just like standard individuals that have kind of that are trying to ascend to godhood. So you might have like the Frost Father, or the Great Enchantress, the Archmage. You know, these are like superheroes essentially that are the Archmage kind of role. Dominion 2 is going to be the more monstrous forms. These are going to be your great dragons and your earth serpents and the thrice-horned boar, the man-eater, you know, things like that. Like the great legendary mythological creatures. These are going to be much more brutish. These are going to be much more meant to be used in direct combat and things like that, which can be a beginner trap if you're not quite certain of what you're doing. It is very easy to just see one of these things and like, oh my, I gotta have the Dracolich, that's so awesome. And then you throw him into a combat all by himself, and he dies because you shouldn't have done that. So they can be very, very powerful, even on their own, just launching into battle all by their own. They can take over provinces left and right if done well and you know what you're doing. But it's also very easy to get them killed right at the start of a game, and then you're left without your god for a while. Dominion 3 is going to be the various titans. So you have like the Son of the Sea, or the Lord of the Forest, the Titan of the Forge, the Keeper of the Bridge, or the All-Father. So these are going to be sort of a combination between 2 and 1 dominions. These are going to be definitely much more powerful than just an average person. And if you look at the Keeper of the Bridge, you look at his stats, he has 80 hit points, he's size 8, he's got 18 magic resistance, 30 morale, he can lead 150 troops. He's like a very just strong, big, powerful commander that also has access to magic. Whereas if you look at, say, the eldest dwarf here, 11 hit points, 4 protection, 12 defense. He's much squishier. It's very easy for this guy to just die like a normal mage. So his strengths do not lie in just brute force, whereas the Dominion 2 ones are very much brute force kind of things. If you look at just the dragon here, 125 hit points, size 10, 18 protection, 18 magic resistance. He gets multiple attacks, tail sweeps, dragon lightning. But be assured that if you don't know what you're doing, it is very easy for something like this to go against even a reasonably small army and die, just due to how many enemy attacks he has to kind of weather. Then there's Dominion 4, and these things are usually going to be like statues or monoliths or great trees. These are often going to be immobile, so they can't actually move around the map without magical support, and some of them can actually not even move with magical support. I don't think any of these have that tag, but there is a certain trait called unteleportable where they can just never move. They will be in your capital from the start of the game or from whenever they come in to the end of the game. So these things are not really generally meant to get sent into combat, although with teleportation magic, they can go into combat, and they can be very painful and very annoying because obviously it's pretty hard to kill a giant magic casting rock. The monolith here has 200 hit points, 28 protection, 18 magic resistance, and he also has slash resistant and pierce resistant, so he takes half damage from any of those types of attacks. And he's going to be just spamming magic spells left and right, because he has 0 encumbrance, things like that. So that it determines the Dominion, the categories determine kind of their general form and somewhat of their function. They also determine the starting level of Dominion, and we'll talk about that in a second. So you can look over all these, you can right click on any of them to kind of get information about their stats and their specific traits, their attacks, maybe their armor or something like that. But you can also see if you press tab, and again, I'll remind you about the question mark to just show you hotkeys so you can see. If you press tab here, you can see all their starting magical paths, and then anything that they might have as a bonus or a malus to different scales. And we'll talk about scales now. So let's just pick this Idol of Beast real quick. So he's going to come in with 1 air and 2 nature. And you can adjust this, and you adjust this and other things using design points. So you have a certain number of design points, and every Pretender chassis costs a certain amount of design points. So you see here, like the Idol Beast costs 170 points, and we go in here, we have 280 right now to spend elsewhere. So you have 450 depending on the chassis you spend. That's 170. Some of these little guys, the eldest dwarf is only 80, so we go in with 370 points. And then some of these might be really quite expensive, upwards of 300 plus or something like that. It depends. I will also mention there are certain pretenders that your nation will actually have a discount for. So if we look at the Tiwas of War here, it's 230, but it's reduced by 20 points for this nation. So he normally costs 250. So you might want to hover over all of them just to see if there's any discounts. These are usually like thematical discounts, something that applies. The nation has some kind of connection with that Pretender chassis and is more likely to be chosen based on a thematic connection. It's not necessarily going to be just, this is the best choice, so that's why it's a discount. But it often is a decent idea to take one of those because you get a little bit more points, but it's never enough points to be like a major swaying decision, I would say. All right, so 280 design points. And if you look at all the paths, you can increase. So you can increase air here, and that will cost you design points. right? And it costs more and more points the higher up you go. So I actually can't even go to 9 air because that would I'd run into the negative on points. So the higher up you go, the more it costs. Whereas I probably could take, yeah, I can take 9 nature, but I can't go to 10. And 10 is, of course, the max. It's very unlikely you're ever going to have 10 just due to the prohibitiveness of the expense. But yes, so you can increase the ones that they come with. So he comes with air and nature, so I can increase those. But you can also buy into other new paths. So if I wanted to get water, I could start getting water. Every pretender is going to have a new path cost. So for this thing, it costs 40 points to break into a new path. And then if I want to go to water 2, it costs 16 more. And then 24 more, and so on and so forth. There's a formula to it. I don't remember it off the top of my head, but yeah, higher levels cost more, and then new paths based on the pretender chassis you're picking. So the Eldest Dwarf, for example, his new paths cost only 20 instead of 40. And then some of them, they cost only 10. Whereas others, usually like the monster forms or the titan forms, they might cost up to 80 new points. So it's very hard for these kind of lesser intelligent monstrous beasts to break into new magic paths. They're kind of set in their ways. Whereas the humans are often these sort of low level or low dominion mages, they're often much more flexible. And they might have, a little bit of everything. They've dabbled in a lot of stuff over their lives and things like that. And you can have a much bigger variety than some other pretenders. Okay, so that's one thing you can spend your design points on. And every level that you take in a path above level 1 is going to generate bless points. Bless points are not really going to be amazingly relevant for Ulm. And I would say you probably could just do well with Ulm by forgetting to spend your bless points at all. Like if you just made a mistake, you accidentally spent nothing, you'd do fine. And that's because bless effects are specifically relevant only to sacred units and commanders. And you can tell if a unit is sacred by looking at their traits, and you see this sort of yellow candelabra. And this means sacred. Extremely devoted to the god's cause. They can be blessed and only require half the usual cost to maintain. So all of your priests are always going to be sacred. That's just part of it. And then you'll have certain other units or commanders that are also going to be sacred. And Ulm is somewhat unique in that it does not have a single sacred unit. That's actually very unique. So we have no sacred units. We just have our sacred priests and mages. So our priest smith is actually sacred because he's a priest. So he can be blessed, and his upkeep cost is half of what it normally is, which is nice because we want to build a lot of these. So activating the bless requires the bless spell, which is available to every priest regardless of level. And so it's an AoE spell. It affects an area of units on the battlefield. You have to cast it every battle in order to put a bless effect on them, and that will activate your whatever your bless you've chosen for them. So just as an example, if we look at all the bless effects, we've picked so far air and nature, so we can look at those bless effects. And so you can scroll over all these and say, you look at resilient. This gives blessed units plus 1 HP. That means that when they are blessed, when they have had blessing cast on them, their max HP will be increased by 1. If they had poison resistance, when they are blessed, they will gain 5 poison resistance. If you had swiftness, whenever they are blessed, they gain plus 30% movement rate and plus 1 defense skill. Things like that. And, I mean, you can just put points into everything real quick. And you could look at all the blessings. This is every blessing in the games. There's quite a few options, many different options, and there's many different strategies. And again, most of these, there are a few that are always active on your sacred units, regardless of whether they're blessed. So even out of combat, they just always have this effect. Such as if we look at this one, which requires 4 earth and 3 nature on your pretender to be able to take. This will make all your sacred units +1 size, have +30% max HP, +3 strength, -1 defense, and +2 map move. So that's always an effect, regardless of blessing. But most of them are going to require the blessing to be cast in combat on them to actually activate. Additionally, a large number of them, are listed as incarnate only. And that means that these will only actually be in effect when your pretender god is on the map. When he is out, when he is not dead, when he is there, when he's present. He doesn't have to be present in the battle. He just has to be alive and somewhere on the map. So these are all going to be the more powerful effects, like giving all your sacred units flight, so they can fly during battle or something like that. Or having double attack speed and things like that. That's all going to be the much higher end effects that are incarnate. Whereas the non-incarnate stuff is going to be generally less effective, less impactful, weaker kind of stuff, such as resistances or HP or things like that. There's a lot to go over. There's a lot to look at. You can look at all that on your own time and sort of make some decisions. Now that you know how all the stats work, that's probably going to be very helpful for discerning different bless effects. I will say that if you're not going to be playing Ulm, if you're going with a different nation that actually has sacred units that you want to use in combat as like infantry, sacred infantry or something like that, I often like to employ what I call a working man's bless. I think it's generally called a stat bless, but it's a very basic thing. It's non-incarnate, so your god could be dead and it's still good. And it basically is pretty solid and just works for a large variety of units, especially like infantry and things like that. It requires fire and water at the very minimum. So you're probably going to have to take something like the Dew of Thunder, or you're going to have to buy into these things. But if you have fire and water, you get access to 2 important things: attack skill bless and defense skill bless. These are very simple. Whenever the sacred unit is blessed, they're going to get +1 defense or +1 attack. But the nice thing is you can actually take multiple of these. So you can take another one. And so right now, anytime I would bless that unit in combat, they would have another +2 attack value and another defense value. And depending on how many points you get, you can take quite a bit. So this is a very low level, easy to take, always kind of available to you working man's bless. That's just going to make probably your good troops just better. And it doesn't require anything to be specially planned around. You don't really have to think about it. It doesn't matter if your god dies. You always have just nice stat bonuses. So I'm a big fan of that with a lot of different nations. If you wanted to make this even better and you have points to spare, there's other things you can take, like if you go into blood. And I know I said don't take blood, don't go into blood, but we're not taking this to actually use blood magic or anything like that. We're just taking it for bless effects. Also, I should mention, the bless effects that you choose do not have to correspond to the specific paths you're taking. So you get bless points that are just universal. So I can take, like, say, 8 levels of glamour. I don't have to take any glamour effects. I can put all those points into attack skill or something, for example. It's just universal bless points. But certain things do require a certain level of the path in order to be available to you. Right, so if you take 4 blood, that gives you access to Blood Surge. And this means that whenever your sacred blessed units kill a living unit, or a living, anything that's not inanimate, they will get a Blood Surge effect for a few rounds. And while that's active, they're going to have another +3 attack value, +3 strength value, +1 defense, and +1 reinvigoration, which is a pretty nice thing that's going to reduce your fatigue by an additional amount every round. And so Blood Surge is a perfect accompaniment to the Working Man's Bless, because it gives us all the stuff we already like and just makes us kind of win more, and it's also not incarnate, so we always have it available. So I almost always throw in Blood Surge as well. So if you can afford it, this is like a really nice Working Man's Bless. Other things that I would maybe throw in there include extra strength, which you can get from earth or blood through stuff like Strength of the Flesh. Or I might also take Enchanted Blood, which gives you magic resistance and also a regeneration every round. It's not much, but it can help keep some units alive. Or if you go into Glamour, you get access to Blur, which means that any units attacking you in melee have their attack skill reduced by 2. Or even Heroism, which is a very cheap one, that gives all your sacred units 35% more XP gain, which I find to be pretty nice, because high XP units have very increased attack and defense values, which I really like. So there's loads of stuff you can look at, and I do encourage you to take a look at some of this higher end stuff, depending on what you're playing. Having, quickness where all your sacred units move and attack twice as fast and get +2 to attack and defense is really amazing. It's very expensive, and you can only have it active when your god is available and out, but stuff like that is crazy impactful. Or Dread, where you're just causing enemy units around you to constantly have to make morale checks and stuff like that. Or Luck, where if they would take a killing blow, they have a 75% chance to just negate it instead. I mean, stuff like that is very powerful, but it's really costly with design points, bless points, and it's incarnate only. So I really recommend, if you just don't want to think about it too much, don't want to do anything fancy, the Working Man's Bless can be very powerful. Right. Then the last couple things, there's Dominion. So this is what we call scales. And this determines sort of within your own dominion, which we'll probably talk about in the next video. Within your own dominion, these are going to be the different effects that kind of determine like the temperature, because some nations prefer the heat, some nations prefer the cold. It's going to determine whether it's a very orderly region or a chaotic region. It's going to determine if it's a very productive region or a slothful region, how lucky it is, a fortunate region or a misfortunate, or how much magic there is or lack of magic, things like that. So this heavily depends on kind of your nation, what they value, and your overall strategy. And with Ulm, it's usually going to be almost always the same. It's what we call a scales nation. It's one that values high-end scales because they have very expensive units, at least for resources. And so that's really going to change. But many nations, you could do wildly different strategies because taking positive scales, so taking order, and if you click +1 order here, you'll see what it does. This is going to increase income in any province we have with order. Increase income by 3%. It's going to reduce unrest by an additional 1. It's going to increase recruitment points by 10%, resources by 3%, and decrease the number of random events that occur by 2%. So this is positive stuff for most nations. This is good things that you want. And that means it costs you design points. So if we take this, to go from 0 to 1, costs us 40 design points. Scales are not cheap, and that's where a lot of your design points are often going to come from, or go to. If we look at productivity, or if we look at turmoil real quick, the negative end, which actually gives you 40 points, your income goes down by 3%, unrest will actually gain by 1, recruitment points go down by 10%, and it's basically the opposite of everything. It's all pretty much worse. Productivity will increase our income by 3%, and our resource generation in that province by 15%, whereas sloth is going to be the opposite. So obviously we don't want sloth as Ulm because we want a lot of resources. Now normally you can only go up to 2 in one direction. So you can go up 2 or down 2 to get towards the the more extreme end of the scales. But there are many things, including national benefits and the Pretender chassis, that might let you go to 3. So Ulm has a productivity limit of +1, which means we can go to 3 productivity instead of 2. You have to pay for it, of course. It just is a limit increase, not a free point. But yeah, I mean, often Ulm is going to go 3 productivity because they need a lot of resources. So something like that. This Pretender actually has an order limit +1, so we can take 3 order if we want. It also reduces the minimum number that you can go. So normally you can go 2 turmoil, but because we have a +1 order limit, we can only go down to 1 turmoil. Usually you wouldn't pick an order Pretender and then take turmoil, but it might affect certain decisions with the nation, such as we have a drain limit of +1. Which means we can go down here on the magic scale, we can go down to 3 drain, which means that all our research normally would have -3 research points generated per mage, whereas magic is a plus, it's a positive modifier. So we can go down to -3. We can't go above magic 1, however, if for some reason we wanted to go into positive magic scales. Temperature basically is largely dependent on the nation's preference. So a lot of nations will say they prefer heat scales +1. And so then anything off from that number is going to have a malus on income and supplies. So the supplies generated by the region each round. So if you're a heat 2 nation, you don't like anything but heat 2. And even heat 1 is going to generate a penalty for you. But most nations are just going to be wanting the default one, and anything off of that. Now, I will tell you that there is a weather system in the game, or there's a seasonal system in the game. So during the summer, you're going to generate an extra heat. And during the winter, you're going to generate extra cold. And so if you take cold 1, during the winter, it might get down to like cold 3 or something, and really hurting your income quite a bit, because it's already adding on to your already existing 1 dominion of coldness. But on the flip side, if you have 1 cold during the summer, it might just flatten out to 0 again or something like that. And so it's not going to be as penalizing to you. So it sort of evens out. I almost always take 1 off in either direction from whatever my nation prefers, because usually the supplies, like I said, it's not really that relevant most of the time, and 5% income is not excruciating, and I generally want more design points when I'm making it to put into other more impactful stuff. Then you have growth and death. So growth is going to generate slightly extra income, more supplies, and also increase the growth rate of provinces under your control. And this is the population amounts. So a province that has a high growth rate is going to generate more and more population every round. And population corresponds to your income from that province, as well as, say, the recruitment points that it generates, I believe. It's sort of a slower effect compared to taking order, because order is going to directly increase your income from every province by 3%. Whereas this is only 1%, but in the long term, you're going to generate a lot more money from having high growth. Because eventually your populations will go up and up and up, whereas normally they might actually go down. They might even out, whereas high growth will allow them to just keep growing and keep generating higher amounts of income every round. Death is the opposite then. You have lower supplies, and you actually have a minus on growth, meaning that they're more likely to go below their numbers. This isn't, if you have death 1, they're not just going to all die off, because every province has its own inherent growth rate. This is just a slight modifier. So it just kind of slows down their growth rate. It's not going to hit the same sort of heights, and it's more likely to just even out or go slightly below sort of the average number that it would have. But yeah, if you do take massive amounts of death, yeah, you might start killing off just all your populations. But even at death 2, that's really not going to happen. Fortune and misfortune, this is going to affect your luck, your event rate. and it actually affects your event rate regardless of which direction you go. What changes mostly is going to be whether it's good effects or bad effects. It's good events or bad events. It also determines like random heroes that you might get that come to your gates and want to join you. So the higher fortune you have, the more likely you are to get some good national heroes coming to you. For me personally, this is something that I often just ignore, or I'll even take Misfortune 1. I don't tend to value it too much, but you know, I can only tell you how I play, really. You're free to make your own decisions. I don't find it to be a super impactful thing, but I also don't almost ever take 2 Misfortune either, because I find that to be really troublesome. But you know, if you're doing what they call like a Hell Bless, where you want the most amount of bless effects or something like that, so you want the most magic points, you will tank, you know, all your scales to the max in order to get the most amount of bless points or something. And that is a strategy that people do with certain nations as well. But for a beginner, I wouldn't really recommend that. There's too many. It's too easy to lose with something like that. You know, it's tough. And then there's magic. Like I said, this just affects. It affects more than research points. I believe it actually affects the fatigue that you generate in combat from casting spells. Let me double check this real quick. I don't want to misspeak. Yes, okay. So if you have a positive magic scale, it actually will cause all your spell casting to generate 10% less fatigue per scale, whereas Drain will generate 10% more fatigue per scale per cast. Also, it affects your unit's magic resistance in the opposite way. So if you have a high magic scale, it actually will reduce your unit's magic resistance because they're kind of infused with magic. Whereas if you take Drain, you have more magic resistance. It's not much. According to this, to the wiki, it's 0.5 magic resistance per scale, rounded down. So to actually get +1 magic resistance on all your units, you'd have to be at 2 Drain. Like by default. But, you know, you'll be generating more fatigue per spell casting. Due to the way Ulm is set up, though, we actually do want the maximum amount of Drain, and we can go to 3. And that's because our mages that we're going to be making are unhindered. So they do not get that -3 research points that we have from our Drain. Now, I'm not sure if our mages are affected by the fatigue generation or anything from having Drain. I think they are affected, but it's still worth taking Drain 3 because we have a nice way of reducing fatigue cost in battle anyways. All right, so what am I actually going to pick? Well, we want high productivity. We want productivity 3. Beyond that, we don't really need much in the way of scales, but we also don't really need much in the way of blesses either. So we're kind of just a scales nation, and we're going to pick something that's relatively simple. I can pick something that we might actually use in combat, but there's the last thing down here, and that's the imprisonment setting. So by default, your pretender will start the game with you. He'll be on your capital turn 1, ready to go, and that's the awake option. And this generates 0 points for you as far as design points. However, if you want him to come in later in the game, you will actually get some free design points. So if you pick Dormant, you get 150 points to spend extra. But he's going to come in around 12 turns into the game, give or take. You don't know the exact amount. It's going to be around 12 turns. If you take Imprison, you get 350 extra points. But he's going to come into the game in 36 turns, give or take. So 3 years. That's a long time. And remember, the most important thing is, well, for one, the incarnate effects. They're not going to be active until your god comes out. So imprisoned gods with incarnate effects won't get those effects for 3 years. Also, there are certain gods that you might want on the map turn 1 to help you expand and take provinces, because your nation lacks, you know, strong troops or strong options at the start of the game before they get magic or something like that, or before they get an economy going. And so they might depend on a pretender, a very strong pretender, to help them take provinces at the start. This is usually called an awake expander, because it's awake and it's meant to expand for you into new territories. And so for them, you want them on the maps, you want awake, but that really hurts the amount of points available to you. So you're not going to be able to take many scales, or you're not going to be able to take many blesses. And so you're paying a price for having this powerful figure on the board. And it can be definitely a newbie trap, like I said, to take a god that you think looks really powerful, and you pick awake, and that gives you very little points to spend with, and you know you're going to take magic, and you say, oh, I want fire magic, but oh, death sounds cool, we want some of that, and oh yeah, these are good numbers, and then oh, I don't know, something, you know, something with this. I mean, look at it, like here I'm already out of points. Okay, I don't know this, and maybe there, okay, that's it. I have 6 points left, and that's all I got. This is a very weak scales, extremely weak, and really not a very powerful pretender, really. Because like I said, a lot of these guys can't just take on armies just on their own. They need magical support, they need research done, or then maybe they need magical items made for them, or something like that, or they need a strong bless, because the bless effects do apply to the pretender as long as you're within your own dominion. So I would recommend, for most nations, especially most beginner-friendly nations, you're going to want to take something that just is probably one of the Dominion 4 guys. Something that's kind of powerful, and, or, you know, something that's something you don't mind just going imprisoned with. Something that's not complicated, gives you a lot of points to spend. And so we might take like this, and this, and take this, and this, something like that. And then we probably want 3 productivity, and maybe we'll take Cold 1, and we'll take Drain 3 for even more points, and we'll take Order 2, and maybe Growth 1. And then there's Dominion. I didn't talk about this. This is your Dominion strength. This determines a couple things, and can be increased later in the game through a couple mechanics. But it's going to determine how many sacred units you can make in, like, your capital, for example. It's usually determined based on your Dominion strength. And also just sort of how strong your Dominion is, how strong the belief is in your deity, which affects... We'll talk about Dominion later. All I can tell you right now, just as a quick thing, is you really don't want to put this below 3. And we can't put the immobile guys below 4, and that's part of why they're a good recommendation for newbies. Prevents you from taking, like, Dominion 2 and kind of killing yourself. So I wouldn't really put it below 3. 4 is all right, but, you know, putting it at 5 or 6 is probably even better. If you have a nation you're playing that has a lot of, or really strong sacreds or something, and you want to make a lot of sacreds, you could bump this up to 7, 8, or even 9, but it does get costly, just like everything else. So we'll put ours, since we're not making any sacreds, we'll just leave it at 4. And this allows us to put a decent amount of points in here. And we do want some earth, and we're going to want some astral. I'll just say that if you're going to pick one of these immobile guys with 0 map move, you want to take at least 3 astral. Because teleportation is an astral spell, and you have to have 3 astral to take it. There are ways around it. There's other things you can do, but just to make it easy, and you know, if you're going to pick an immobile one, you might want to be able to move them around. So Astral 3 is the way to do that. Then you're going to reach a point where it's like, okay, so I have 8 points left. Can't really spend anything else. I have 19 bless points. This is way too strong of a bless for Ulm. But yeah, I mean, we could go even higher on scales, to be honest, but we'll leave it, because our sacreds, like I said, are our mages, and so it's easy to do a working man's bless when you have strong sacred infantry. But what do you do for mages? Well, there's a few things. I'd say the big thing that you probably want is going to be reinvigoration, which is a 2 Earth Bless. And this gives you +1 Reinvigoration, meaning every round they will recover 1 extra fatigue. And this can be stacked. So if you take, say, 4 or 5 Reinvigoration, and your guys are blessed, your mages are blessed, assuming they can be, every round they're going to recover an extra 5 fatigue. And that's the biggest factor limiting how many spells you can cast in combat is going to be your fatigue. I've heard counter arguments that it actually isn't that impactful or worth taking, but for Ulm, there's really not much else to take for our mages. So Reinvigoration 5. We can also take, say, Magic Resistance, because enemy mages can try to like take you out using magic spells, you know, mage battles and things like that, and or you know, casting certain spells on you. And having good magic resistance can prevent that. But we are already at 14, so it's not the end of the world. There's also, if we take Astral 4, we can get Farcaster, which increases our spell range in combat by 50%, which is pretty great. I think I'll actually ditch Blood, and we'll take more Astral. There we go. So we'll take Farcaster. And then we can also take Arcane Finesse, which gives us +1 penetration. And so when you're casting a spell that requires magic resistance roll, the number that you're generating is actually based on your penetration. So this makes us more likely to get some of our non-damaging spells through onto targets. So that's not a bad idea either. And then we also could just throw in Heroism, because I always like to throw it in, because I find it enjoyable. And there you go. There's sort of our Mage Bless. This wouldn't really be good for any sort of actual sacred unit or infantry or something like that, except Reinvigoration's not too bad, and Heroism's good, but yeah, Farcaster Arcane Finesse is specifically good for our casters. And there you go. That's going to be what we go with. Then you get to enter a name. You can enter any name you want, or they'll generate one. And then we get to the settings for the actual game. We're over 2 hours now, so I don't want to take too long here. But you can determine how many provinces each nation is going to start with. So by default, it's just your capital. You can determine the strength of independence. I wouldn't really recommend changing this. You can make it easier, but I think it's a good thing to sort of learn what the average strength of independence are and learn how their average composition is. I really wouldn't recommend making it harder. Because compared to earlier games in the series, Dominion 6 already has harder independent armies. So 4 is perfectly fine. And then the special site frequency. This determines how many magic sites are going to be around the map. This is already predetermined based on the age you're in. So 55 for middle age, 65 I think for early age, and 45 for late age. But you could change it if you want. And then if you want to do any resource multipliers for income, resource, recruitment, and supply values, we'll leave that as default. Then various things that I don't really have to go over, not super applicable, but you can change how rare or common random events are. So it recommends if you're playing really slow games like play by email, you can have common events, so something's happening basically every turn. Or, you know, for most games, you probably don't want stuff just constantly happening to everybody every turn. But that's a preference that you can decide. Story events. These are usually not recommended for new players because the story events sound cool, but they're really kind of cryptic. They're hard to discern. They can be kind of impactful and things like that. So I'd probably recommend that you disable it or just enable minor ones if you're really interested. We'll leave it disabled to not complicate things. And then score graphs. This allows you to look at like army size, how many provinces your enemies control, how much dominion they're generating, research they're generating, things like that. I often like to play with it enabled just so I can kind of get a read on all the AI, because I figure the AI gets to see all that information for me, so fair is fair. But by default, it's disabled, and obviously for multiplayer, it's almost always going to be disabled. So we'll leave it enabled just so I can maybe talk about it a little bit. Diplomacy. So you can form non-aggression pacts with the AI in single player. If it's binding, then you can form them, and the AI will not attack you, and you actually cannot attack them. You just will not be allowed to until it's broken. And you can break it by sending a message, and then 3 turns later, it will be broken, and then a war can commence. So that's a binding agreement. Weak agreements, you can form them, but they can be broken at will and without warning. So you can make one with the AI, and they'll respect it until suddenly they might not respect it and just attack you. And then you can just turn it off, so there's no non-aggression pacts of any kind. We'll leave it on binding because that's usually how I play, but I will tell you that it is kind of a cheesy way to play against the AI, because you can just keep sending non-aggression pact proposals to the AI, and they will eventually agree. And they're not super likely to break them. So it is possible for you to kind of just sign non-aggression pacts with every enemy and then never get into any wars. But at the same time, that's, that's up to you if that's how you want to play. To be fair, that is often how I play, but the AI doesn't always, sometimes they can refuse many, many times, and it does hurt you a little bit. And you might not always want to be able to not attack them, because they might be in the way of the victory conditions, so you might have to attack them. Other things, I would leave these all default. They're also kind of advanced stuff that you don't have to worry about. The human AI level, that does not apply in these single-player games at all, so don't worry about that. You can change on whether or not you get random start research or not. I'd recommend just leaving it on random. Not having a random doesn't mean you get to pick. It just means it spreads the research out equally among all the paths, or the schools. You can enable renaming. It should be default. I don't know why it isn't, but this lets you rename commanders and stuff to whatever you want. Either for funny names or to rename them to, like, remind you of what they might do or what they're meant to be doing. All right, and then the thrones menu. And this is going to determine the victory condition. So there's 2 types of victory conditions. There's conquering all, winning by eliminating all other pretender gods. Which is probably going to be a pretty lengthy game if you're playing with more than one opponent. That is going to take a while. More commonly, it's going to be Thrones of Ascension. These are going to be specific provinces throughout the map that have a throne. They're going to have a more powerful independent army on them by default. And you have to beat the big army, and then you have to claim the Throne of Ascension by either using your Pretender God or a level 3 priest. Or a level 4 priest, I suppose. And then you can determine how many Ascension points are required and the level of thrones. So a level 1 throne will generate 1, 2, 3. The default setting here is 6 points required and 6 level 1 thrones, which means that you need to go around the map and get all 6 thrones and hold them at the same time in order to win. This is going to be pretty close to just doing Conquer All. And my first game I ever did, I had these settings, and I basically won by eliminating every other nation. So I really wouldn't recommend these default settings for your first game. I would recommend a different setting here that I read about elsewhere. And that's basically to do, say, 1 level 1 throne, 1 level 2 throne, and then 1 level 3 throne for 6 points. It's still going to be perhaps a bit of a tricky game, depending on where these thrones are. You might still have to wipe out a couple nations. But this way you win by either taking both of the level 1 and 2 thrones, so those 2, or just... Oh, no. Put it... Right. No. Sorry. So set the ascension points to 3. The required number is 3. So you get 1 point for the level 1 and 2 points for the level 2. So you can take both of those to win. Or just the level 3 throne, which is not going to be easy to take, especially for your first game. But if you manage to do it, you just take that and you win. Okay? If you want sort of a slightly more flexible, potentially longer, potentially short, it depends on the placement, you can just double all these numbers. So it requires 6 points, and then you put in 2 level 1s, 2 level 2s, and 2 level 3s. And this gives you, maybe you take like one of the level 3s, one of the level 2s, one of the level 1s, things like that. So we'll put it at that for now. The last thing here is the Cataclysm. I have never played a Cataclysm game. So I can't really talk about how much it impacts, but basically you set a certain turn limit. And once that turn limit hits, the default is 91. So once that turn limit hits, there's going to be things that go around, these horrible monsters called horrors, that go around and appear every round and kill or destroy thrones. And they're going to do that until there's a winner decided. It is possible to kind of, I've heard, I guess, you can defend the thrones against the horrors, but it's very difficult. But eventually a winner will be decided relatively quickly. So this is sort of just like a unique turn limiter to the game to make sure there's a winner by, around this amount of turns. But for single player purposes, I've never bothered with it. I might try it soon just to see what it's like. But yeah, that's how that works. All right, and with that, we can hit OK, and we will generate our game. Okay. And you're always told that in the beginning there was chaos, and now the wheel has turned once again, because this is a big cycle that happens over and over and over. All right, and here's where I will end this basic video. I would say at this point, you are probably equipped enough to probably look over a lot of nations and see what they're like. You might even be able to get into the game and learn from here and figure things out. I would say that if you are going to just start playing and not watch the second video where I will actually take some turns, all I can tell you is do not expand on your first turn, because right now you will see that there are provinces around you that just have a flag, and you can move commanders onto them, but you do not know what is sitting there. There could be a massive army of like 150, or there could be 20 guys. You do not know, and it is generally not recommended to move out on your first turn. Because on the second turn, you will now have information about what's around you, and you can make a better decision. That's all I can tell you, for a very important thing. I have heard too many stories of new players picking a pretender god, throwing him out there on turn 1, and him dying. So do not make that mistake. Just wait one turn. But all right, that's going to be the end of my very, very basics video, which is over 2 hours long. Yeah, there's just no way to get this amount of information out there in a much quicker time. And there's just too much to go over. There are much shorter new player videos, I know, but I felt like they went over too little to really help players get started, and I wanted to rectify that. So I hope this was helpful at least, and I hope that you stick around for the second video, where I will go over making units and taking provinces and actually go over battles and perhaps casting spells and things like that. But for now, my name is Mang. This has been How to Play Dominion 6, and I'll see you fine folks next time.